People who get locked into a vision. All right, that's it, man. That's their drive. That's their passion. Critics don't matter. This don't matter. They're going to do whatever it fucking takes to be the best at what they do.
This is Dave Tate with another edition of Table Talk. Today we have a two-part, what do you call this? Two-part podcast.
Yeah, that's probably how I would describe it.
And so the first part, what we're going to do is a couple episodes back, we had one of our interns, Mason, on for an introduction, I guess is pretty much all it really was. And then from there, I meet with him each week to discuss training, programming, stuff like that. So we've met twice before this. So what we're going to do is kind of go over what we touched on quickly.
Yeah.
We can't go over everything, and then kind of let you guys be a fly on the wall for what we're going to discuss today. And then once we get through that section, we have some questions that I have here to answer, which I think you guys will be interested in. So what I'll do to start out with, my voice is kind of raspy, so deal with it, is go over what we went over last week and the week before. So I think with anybody getting in the strength and conditioning industry, albeit personal trainer or strength coach, they have to understand basic program design. So that means understanding linear periodization, block periodization, and conjugate periodization. Bodybuilding methods can be a topic for another discussion, but they have their place, but it's not really that periodized to be able to lay out somewhat of a structure. And when you're speaking about periodization, there's some things that need to be understood before you can even have a conversation about it. So some of those things were basic definitions that we discussed the first time, and these are interchangeable, especially because people, in my opinion, have used them incorrectly for so long that it's become correct. But if you're having a conversation with somebody, you have to understand how they define volume and how they define workload. Pretty much everybody understands sets and reps, at least they should. So that doesn't really have to be defined. But workload and volume are things that really get used interchangeably a lot, and it completely changes the context of any conversation that you're having. Many times somebody will come to me and say, well, so-and-so said that, they like to have the volume, ramp up before a competition or come down before a competition or whatever it's going to be. And I always have to ask, what exactly do you consider the volume? Because to me, that's sets times reps, where workload would be sets times reps times weight. And regardless if you call one volume and the other workload, you have to distinguish between those two if you're having a conversation. Because if somebody's speaking to me and tells me that the volume's going to, taper up or taper down, I'm thinking total sets times reps for that training day. And they could be speaking about workload. Along with those, I think there has to be a distinction between which intensity group of the training session, we haven't really got into this yet, that you're talking about. And to briefly illustrate what I'm trying to say here, if somebody is talking about workload, the total weight lifted sets times reps, the total workload of a core movement, say a squat or clean or whatever the core movement is, that's going to be the front end movement of the training day. Whatever that workload is going to be completely different than what the workload is for an accessory exercise. For example, let's say somebody their workload is going to consist of 400 pound squats for 3 sets of 2. So 800 times 3, which 2,400. That's the workload of what I would call group A, core main movement. So we got 2,400 pounds. Now, if somebody is going to use 200 pounds for sets of 10, 5 sets of 10 on a reverse hyper, you got 10,000 pounds. So when somebody says their total workload for that training day was under 13,000 pounds, that scenario that I just gave you is completely different than if they did 13,000 pounds of squats. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Completely. We're not even having the same conversation at that point in time. So when people talk about total workload and even total volume for that standpoint, you got to know of what and where, because that has significance. If the training load is under a 50% load, 50 to 60, 70, and so forth up there. So it helps you to probe the conversation a little better. There's no defined rules for everything, but you at least need to speak the same language before you can sit and say, oh, I don't think I agree with what you're saying. How can you not agree with what you're saying if you don't even understand what the fuck they're saying? If you don't probe deeper from that standpoint. So to go back, we went over the linear periodization, which is very simple to find. It's pretty much how everybody trains for strength and conditioning, where you have a hypertrophy phase followed by a strength phase, followed by a power phase, followed by a peak phase. I'm blowing over this real fast, but essentially you start, high volume, low intensity being percentage of 1 rep max. And then that flips as you go through the training cycle to where the intensity increases and the volume, intensity increases, volume decreases to where you get a peak. The limitations that are inherently built into that is you can lose a lot of the conditioning and the hypertrophy that's gained during the first 4 weeks by the time you need to peak. There's a big void or a big gap in education in regards to what you're supposed to do with any type of secondary or auxiliary exercises, or if you're even supposed to do them at all. So a lot of times when you read anything about, basic Western method of periodization, linear periodization, whatever it's going to be, that's always left out. They always speak about that one core movement, but then everything else is kind of like left blank. So what do? Just 3 sets of 10? So there's a gap that's there as well. The issue with the peaking becomes complicated if you're dealing with a sport that's not a pure strength sport, like Olympic weightlifting, powerlifting. I mean, it even gets convoluted when you start talking about strongman because the strength components are a little bit different. So there's that limitation that's there as well. And then the other limitation, I'm sure there's more, but these are main ones that you're looking at, is peak for what? So if you're a powerlifter, yes, it makes sense. You got to meet, you're going to peak for that. Or if you're training for a max, whatever, you're going to peak for that. If you're a football player or some other athlete, are you going to peak before 2-a-days, or are you going to peak before the season starts, or are you going to peak mid-season, or you can peak, when are you going to peak? So that brings flaws as well. Some of the ways to get over the flaws that are in there, because with any type of periodization, you're going to deal with flaws and strengths associated with it. There's no such thing as a perfect program. So this is why there's no perfect program. Anybody that tells you that they figured out the perfect program is full of shit, or they quit learning. So I'll just leave it at that. I'm going to go into a rant about that. But when you know what the limitations are, then you can go about trying to fill those holes the best that you can. So with basic linear, you're going to be dealing with the limitations that I spoke about. So you can cross hypertrophy training throughout the whole training program, and then only dive it down when absolutely necessary before a peak is needed. The peaking for what? That becomes a really big question, where the limiting factor in there is there's a peak phase. Is it really necessary if it is a football player or a skill type athlete that's not powerlifter? Do they really need to be focusing on, heavy singles and peaking their 1 rep maximum strength, or do they need to be focused on peaking their strength to be better at what they're actually playing? So that can be a solution there. It's just, is it necessary to even have it in there? And it's hard for me to say stuff like that because I have a bias that kind of works against that, but that's how you kind of go about doing that. So it's important to understand the basic periodization. And anybody that's studied any type of periodization or training, this isn't that hard to understand. It's pretty easy to understand a linear model. So, but it's necessary to learn it and to understand it, because you'll be able to find your own holes that you can poke in it, and then you can play the mental gymnastics of trying to figure out how would you try to not have that occur, because once you plug that hole, another one's going to emerge. That's training. It's just how it works, and that's just in the program part. You're not even implementing it yet. So when you implement, a bunch of holes are blowing up all over the place. But the more solid that you can get everything, the better it's going to be, because some holes don't need to blow because they're blowing just because the program's not structured and solid. So understanding that, to me, there's no excuse if you're in this industry to not understand it, because it's very simple to find. You can search it. You can find pros and cons of all that. The one thing, and we spoke about this the first time, the one thing you need to understand is everybody's going to have their bias, because everybody's trying to sell a program. Bottom line. So if you understand what that is, then you can find that's your first hole. So when you're reviewing whatever information you're looking at, the first hole is the author's bias. So then you can just skip over that. And if you're reviewing other programs that people have put together and sold or sell, and you're looking at that program, what I tell people is don't even read the introduction, because all the introduction is going to tell you is what they did in the past that didn't work and why they suck so bad. But then they found this program that they're currently doing, and that's what made them so great. And if you actually do a deep dive and look into it, everything that they did before that program was probably better than the program that they actually did. But they leave that out because they're not trying to sell what they did before that program. And most of the people that are going to put together a program that they're going to sell, as far as an ebook or whatever it's going to be, they're selling that to people that were in their shoes 10 years ago, 15 years ago. But they're writing in a way that basically says, if I could go back in time, this is the only thing that I would do. And I find that to not be true, because if it was the only thing that they were going to do, and they did that for the 10 or 15 years like they did the other stuff, then the book that they're writing would have an introduction trashing what they're currently doing is not being optimal, because it's all part of it. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, like
it's fun to read the stories, right? And to me, it's frustrating sometimes, because a lot of the times it's always ripping on something that they used to do that works very well for a lot of people. So if it still works very well for a lot of people, then maybe there's more than one way to do it. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But when you're trying to sell something, I don't want to go down that road again. We already talked about that. You speak in absolutes because that makes you look smarter and whatever. To me, it makes you just look fucking stupid because you don't really understand anything. So then we went into block training, which we discussed loosely the last time. And block periodization, there's a lot of similarities between block periodization and a linear model. You can make the argument that the linear model has a hypertrophy phase and a strength phase. So what's the real difference, except for the name of being an accumulation phase, transition phase, and then realization phase? Everybody's got different names for it. Typically, you'll see Urslan being the one that's quoted for block periodization. But from a standpoint of developing the program, it's different. Because with a linear model, you're basically going to have that 12 weeks that's laid out, because that's really all you really see, 12, 16 weeks, whatever it's going to be. Then there's a big gap, which happens after the peak. If it's an athlete, they don't have a gap after actually, they don't even have, most of the time, they don't even have 12 weeks to string together that's consistent. So then you have to look at what the availability is of each training phase that they can have. For instance, a Division I football player, it's kind of, there's 4 weeks, 8 weeks, maybe 10. It changes a lot. Then you have NCAA compliant. You have all these other factors that kind of play into that. But they don't have these nice, clean 6 week, 2 week break, 6 week, 2 week break. So as far as organizing of training, unless you're in a strength sport and don't have any other responsibilities, there's no such thing as optimal. You know what I'm saying? Because everything that you'll see that's laid out for program and organization of training, it's going to be laid out for Olympic athletes. So if you're looking at the, Russian literature or, Medvedev, Ursulin, Verkhoshansky, all these other people. So all those structures that you're seeing laid out, that's what it's for. So they're showing what they feel is optimal, but in the real world, you're not going to have somebody that shows up and says, okay, I'm going to play, football, and I'm not going to have a job. I'm not going to have classes. I'm not going to have a girlfriend. I'm not going to, you can't control all the stressors that are associated with that. Even from the standpoint of powerlifting, which I'm more familiar with, you still don't have optimal, because people work, they have jobs, they have a life. So that's factored in there. And then you'll say, okay, you're lucky enough to get the person that doesn't give a fuck about a job. Okay, so they don't need to work, but they're still stressing out about money and whatever else it is. And typically what I found, when you get the people that don't have to stress about job, work, all this other kind of stuff, what they do have to stress about, they stress about 10 times more. Okay, so take the big ones: work, family, kids, whatever it is, what. So let's remove, a significant other. Let's revert, and just say it's work. They're going to stress a million times more about work than somebody that has to balance all three. Or if they don't have the job, then they have a girlfriend, all they do is bitch about, saying?
Yeah.
Bitch about whatever relationship that they're in, and that's stressing them out to the max. So that's just what I've seen over. People are always going to find things to stress about. Yeah. So you want to find the people, you want to get them to stress minimally about the most things they possibly can instead of maximally about one thing. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah. You spread it out so they can't just, dive into the hole and go into that cyclical thing.
Because that spills over into the training.
Yeah.
With block, I like to have people go through Bumpa's periodization of strength. It's not exactly, block periodization, so to say, but it does break down different phases, which I had you look at, which is the what's the AA phase, anatomical adaptation, which is contention, hypertrophy. So what is really good about Tunor's book, and this is periodization of strength, is he gives you very clear variables on what those are, which were 4 to 6 exercises. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then the repetition range is, I think, 6 to 12 or somewhere in that. It's hypertrophy repetition range. And the only thing that gets a little funky with that is the number of exercises. There's always the variance, right? I call it the cover your ass variance. So it will say you need to do 4. I mean, that's a little close. 4 to 6 exercises. Well, that's fucking a 20% difference, plus or minus.
Yeah.
So there's a big variance. The repetition 6 to 10. Again, that's a what, 40% variance. So you got a lot of room to pivot. The key thing with that is whenever you're dealing with a phase like that, so a conditioning phase, there are some rules that he has in there which are important to note, and that is you want to train from the core out, from your priority. And as a strength coach, you'll understand that. As an athlete, you don't want to do that. The athletes want to train from the fingers in, right? So they want to train the biceps before they train abs. They want to train, they don't want to train the legs at all, but they're going to want to train quads before they're going to want to train hips, but if you think from spinal erectors, rectus abdominis, everything out, then you're thinking performance and strength, because that's everything. I still use the example of, if you want to think about transfer of force in any sporting event, of course I'm going to use powerlifting because I'm just going to throw that out there. I always use powerlifting because that's what I know best. And it's actually easier for people to understand. because it's squat, bench. It's pretty simple movements to be able to picture. If you apply force through the ground, and then it's going to come up through your body, and there's a marshmallow in your waist instead, all that gets lost in there. So the transfer is never really going to go to the bar. A bench press the same way. If you're trying to drive or push your legs into the floor to get tight, and that transfer gets lost through there, then you're not going to be tight. Deadlift the same way. So if you remove the marshmallow, put a rock in, now you can see how that transfer is going to be able to go through. But we don't have marshmallows, we don't have rocks. We have muscles and we have breathing. So breathing is definitely a big part of it, but you can breathe perfectly and have weak fucking abs and weak erectors and still suck, right? Yeah. So this kind of is another peeve of mine is, when it comes to the structure of, say, the core, everybody hates the word core, but what the fuck else are you going to call it? Yeah. You know torso. What I'm saying? Yeah, exactly. Torso, core, whatever. And they'll want to focus on psoas, rectus abdominis, and all these muscles, right? And that becomes the talking point. Like, this is really important. You have to do this so you can activate this and this and this. Well, I always kind of step back and think to myself from a global perspective. Common sense, always plays a huge role. Is what about the fucking rectus abdominis? What about the obliques? What about the spinal erectors? Because last time I checked, they're pretty fucking big muscles. So you can have, involuntary muscles, which I'm not even sure how you hypertrophy or make stronger an involuntary muscle, right? So you can have those, which are doing exactly everything they're supposed to do, but your fucking abs and lower back are still weak, and guess what's going to happen? You're not going to have the transfer of power. You're not going to get stronger. You're going to get hurt because you don't have that stability in there. So you can do all the fancy, core movements that you want, but if you're not covering your bases, developing those big muscles around the torso, you're going to pay the price, at some point or another. Fortunately, based upon different training philosophies, we know this to be true. If you're doing big compound movements all the time, you may not have to do anything to specialize those muscles. Good morning, squats, deadlifts, overhead, all stuff like that is going to inherently build that core. So crunches ain't going to do a whole fucking lot. But let's say you can't do any core muscles, then you need to do something, for those muscles. So from that standpoint, training, the core out is huge. Do you remember what any of the other ones were that he had in there?
For
the 4 pillars
of anatomical adaptation.
Yep.
Core, stabilizers. I wrote this down in the other notebook I have. Stabilizers, balancing left and right, asymmetries, and balancing flexors and extenders of a joint.
Yes, and so that's, again, kind of common sense. So there's going to be some asymmetry whenever you're dealing with a beginner, always. One arm's going to be stronger than the other arm because they're right-handed or left-handed, whatever it is. So the question comes up, when do you pay attention to it, when do you not? So if it's not that big of a difference, say a dumbbell press, you might have, they can do 20 pounds on one arm, 25 on the other arm. To me, don't worry about it. It's going to balance out as they get stronger. 45 pounds on one arm, 15 on another, you got a problem. You got something that you're going to have to work on. Those problems like that are rare. I've probably actually trained, not people read my article and they did it. 1,000 people maybe. I've only seen that less than a handful of times. So it's rare. And dealing with Gen Pop and beginner athletes, that's where you're typically going to see. Obviously, if somebody tears a muscle, you're going to see it there too, but that's rehab. That's not, that's not strength and conditioning. But those are pretty easy to find. The bigger one that you're going to see a lot is going to be upper body strength to lower body strength or vice versa. That's also easier to be able to accommodate and to be able to fix. The if their lower body's dominant and they're an athlete, I never gave a shit. That's fine. Let's build the stabilizer, especially the shoulder joint. Build that up, because when you're speaking about risk of injury, that's it. With an athlete, you mentally got to think of what they actually do. So what's the energy demand, which we'll talk about later. But what's the energy demand? But where's the highest incident of how they could get hurt? So you can look and see where the most prevalent injuries are for athletes, and you're going to see ankle, knee. You're going to see a lot of injuries sometimes that are related to holes in the ground, uneven planes, or contact injuries. So you got to separate those things from other ones. Where things that I saw a lot would be arms being ripped back. So if it's a soccer player, football player, any type of contact player, they get their arm cranked back through contact or something like that. Shoulder is going to get wrenched to hell. So how can we build that up so it's protected from that standpoint? Those are the type of things you want to look at. What do you have control over? You do have control over ankle mobility, stuff that you can do there, which is important for athletes as well. How this all relates to block, because it falls into that first phase, which as a strength coach, high school, college, most of your work is all going to happen in that block. Do you understand that?
Yeah.
Because they're not going to have the muscle mass. They're not going to have the training knowledge or education or neural efficiency or anything like to really move out of that block for a while. I don't even know if I would call it a block, because you're going to have to break it into different training macro cycles, which I don't think we covered that. Just from a structure standpoint and a periodization standpoint, I hardly ever use these terms because I'd rather use long plan, quadrennial, long plan, short plan, where you have, a mesophase, which can be a year, can be 4 years. You kind of determine this is why I stay away from the things like that, because you kind of determine what it's going to be. Then you have microphase or a macrophase, then a microphase. So macro could be 3 months, a month. Micros could be a day, could be a week. They're terms I don't like to use because I see it used too much by people that are just, to me, it's never enhanced the education process to be able to tell somebody what's really going on. Because it's easier for me to say, a week training period can be 5 days to 10 days. And most people get that. It's like, say you got a 4-day program, day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, then it's going to repeat over, whatever it's going to be. You can either roll it over into the second week, or you can just say, look, my week's going to be 8 days. You get what I'm saying? So you have a day rest in between each one of those things. That's easier to understand than say, well, you can do 3 microcycles in a macro. It's like, what the fuck? You're getting all confused. It's like using the word speed, strength, speed. People are like, what the fuck are you talking about? It's easier just to dial it back and say what the hell it is, and then kind of go from there. So that in mind, that hypertrophy phase, conditioning phase, whatever you want to call it, you'll see in a lot of programs broken down into several different areas of specialization. Let's call it that way. Some coaches will have, lower body dominant, upper body dominant, kind of fluctuated in through there. Some will be, I'm trying to think of different examples because I've seen about anything you can think of can basically be cycled through there if it falls within those parameters that were kind of laid out from that standpoint. The number of exercises becomes a debatable term because that is also based upon the level of conditioning. So if somebody starts at 4 exercises and you keep them at 4 exercises for too long of a period of time, they're going to adapt to that. And it's going to have to either go to 5 exercises or something else is going to have to change. So there's no rule. You see what I'm saying? Yeah. So it all has to kind of build from that standpoint. It's really from a block perspective, I don't know where else to go. You know what I'm saying? Do you have any questions that you picked up?
Not off block, as I kind of had a background enough to, follow along just fine.
Okay. With your background through that's been through your own training, right?
Yeah, training and just reading other
and
stuff.
reading and so forth. What were the things that you found enticing about block compared to, just a straight linear?
Well, it's versus straight linear. Obviously, if you're talking about athletics or you're talking about strongman, anything that's really not powerlifting or Olympic weightlifting, you don't always have 12, 16 weeks to go from 10s to 1s. It's nice, especially if you have your weirder peaks, to go max strength, power, or like do your double peaks or peak different attributes where the intensity is not moving in a linear range downward and stuff like that. So I'd say that's the biggest advantage, is when you aren't in a linear sport.
Okay. With linear, I don't know if I touched on this very much. There's also non-linear. There's different ways to break, the linear periodization to where a non-linear. There's many ways. And there's linear, then, you know what I'm saying? There's many ways to not be linear. So, one of the more popular ways that I'll see if they're driving the percents up 5% per week, so 60, 65, 70. Then instead of going 75, they'll go down to that middle week, which is like 65, and then 70, 75.
Yeah.
And then drop, and then kind of step up like that. What I found that was a really hard thing for intermediates to beginners to deal with is they're going from, say, a 75% down, to that 65, and then building back up. They're away from that 75 for too long that when they get back to it, they don't know what to do, and it kind of, as it waves up like that becomes a bigger area of concern, because it's 60, 70%, not really that big of a deal. 80, 85%, dropping back down to 80% and then going 85%. They'll see that as, what the hell, I just did 4 weeks of the same thing, because they see weights.
Yeah.
They don't see, the percent. They don't see what's really going on. So it's like, coach, what the fuck? Why am I doing the same things? I can do more. So you're dealing with the mental aspect. You're dealing with all those other things. Another way that people will break the linear model is to basically just deload, take a week off. So 60, 65, 70, week off, and then come back at that 75. All right. That's a mind fuck for people too, especially when they're intermediates and below. Advanced people are like, fucking cool, because they already know that if they pull back before a meet, that they're going to be stronger. So they'll know, I'll be way better when I come back at this. The intermediates, beginners, they don't know that, plus they don't have that neural ability for that either. So when they come back, it doesn't feel like 75%. It feels like fucking 90%. And now they're head fucked, so those are all things that can be experimented with, with yourself. But at the same time, you need to understand that when it goes to be implemented, it's going to be implemented with yourself 5 years ago. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So a lot of times coaches will get in the mindset of, and I do believe you should do anything that you're going to ask anybody to do. I do believe that. But you have to understand that if you've been doing this for 5, 10, 15 years, your ability to do it and your own auto-regulatory feedback is completely different than somebody that's only been doing it for a year or two. So what you're gaining from doing it isn't really applicable to the person that you're going to ask to do it, unless you can think back to, when I was there, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Or you have enough experience training that level of athlete to know what their, response is going to be from that. Anyhow, with the block, I don't want to get into the conjugate on this conversation, but, I'm trying to blow through all the periodization stuff so we can get into actual training days, and the fun stuff. I mean, this is kind of like to me, it's boring stuff.
Yeah.
Because I've been doing it. I guess it's boring to me. You know, it may not be boring to you, but getting into the actual putting the variables in, that's where things are a lot better. The one thing I did not cover though, and should have been covered first, is the basic needs analysis. You know, and you can find, you know, the NSCA's got really good ones. You can find a lot of really good ones that are out there. But a lot of times what you'll find with them is they're just going to be a basic health history or an extension of a health history. And that's better than nothing. You have to have that. Let me step back. You have to have that. Okay, that has to be done. So, and a lot of things might pop up. And this is what you get the degree for. This is what you get the certifications for. Not so much for you to know what to do if things come up, but for you to know what not to do if things come up. So high blood pressure, you know, comes up. Could just be stress, could just be the day, you know, but it tells you you probably need to take it again. And if it's too high, you're not going to train them. But if it's borderline high, then it's take it again. You check medical history and kind of go from there and see. But if there's that point where it's like, this has got to go to somebody else. And that's what health history is for. You'll see, you know, previous injury, you'll see, you know, medical conditions, medications, you know, so if you're going to do heart rate variable training and they're on beta blockers, good luck, you know, so that has to be known and understood, because if you're trying to push them to a max heart rate and you can't wonder why the fuck it's not getting there, you know, there's probably a good explanation for that. And you can't assume they're going to tell you. Okay, they're never going to tell you the things that you really need to know. You have to pry it out of them. So you can have a clean health history and then find out they had shoulder surgery 2 years ago.
Yeah.
They didn't think it mattered because it wasn't within 12 months.
Yeah.
Fuck, too, don't matter. You know, so it's not just a matter of having that health history, but having the discussion that goes along with the health history. If you're in a collegiate setting, more than likely you're going to have the sport med, you're going to have other people that are going to be responsible for vetting that out before you even see them. But never assume that's the case, because it never hurts to say, hey, look, can I browse over, you know, their health history real quick just to be sure, you know. And if you're going to hit resistance, especially in a collegiate setting, then you ask the, you know, head strength coach, look, how do you deal with this, you know, and they'll tell you how they're going to deal with it. But a Gen Pop or a personal trainer or, you know, online trainer, as far as that goes, this has to be reviewed. It has to be, because it definitely goes into the design of the program, especially if there's pre-existing conditions that are going to impact the training. So the health history, and I always went a step further, and we'll go health history and then current health and then health forecast. Okay, so I want to know, you know, if it's the beta blockers or whatever it is, how long you've been on it, how are you responding to the medication, do you still have side effects from the medication? If it's, you know, heart meds, you know, are you fatigued from the medication? Is that gone? Have you, you know, there's always a slew of different medications for every different condition, and you're not a doctor. Yeah. Like, you understand that, so you can't prescribe, you can't do any other stuff, but you can ask questions to be able to figure out, are they in the process of trying to find a better medication than what they're actually on, because the side effects of the medication they're on now makes them feel like they're arthritic. That's kind of important to know, especially if you're asking them when they come in, how did you feel from the last training session? Oh, my joints hurt like hell. Is it the training session, or is it that they just switched because they're trying to find a medication that's not as bad on their joints? So it's not as complicated as I'm making it out to be, but I'd rather have somebody be more afraid than not. And a health forecast, you know, is kind of what is the family history, especially if, I don't know how long you'll have the athletes. I mean, typically 3-4 years, unless you're in a private sector, then it can be longer than that. So if you're in a private sector and you're working with, I know some private sector trainers that have worked with kids from junior high school all the way to the NFL. So from them, it would be good as soon as they realize, look, this is kind of has the potential to be a long-term thing. What's the health forecast? What's your family history as far as joint health, arthritis, wear and tear, stuff like that, because that will definitely impact how you're going to look at this player as far as longevity from the sport, because wear and tear is wear and tear. Even if it's good technique, bad technique. Good technique is going to be better than bad technique. Yes, I agree with that, but it's still wear and tear. So that can make a huge difference if you know this is going to be potential to be a long-term thing, to where this person may be in the sport for 10 years. And then the goal is to get them 11 years. Optimally, it'd be great to be able to get them when they're in high school and have them all the way through, because then you can have some impact on that optimally. What's the odds of that happening? 1 in 1,000. So, but it's good to think about. Now, outside of the health history, I like to know their training history. That probably applies more to any type of specialized, individualized program design than anything else, because I want to know how long they've been training, and if it extends past a few years, then in my mind, they've already figured a lot of stuff out, because there's a big difference that I've found in experience level between 3 and 5 years. Big. 3 years, I think a lot of people may just still be trying to figure out if they really like this. Usually before that 3-year point, things have already gotten hard. They've realized, ooh, shit, I'm not going to get these beginner gains like I used to all the time. This is a little more difficult than I thought, and it's going to take more consistency. It's going to make time. They start learning, start figuring stuff out. So if you have that conversation on what have you done in the past, what have you liked, what have you not liked, you can learn a hell of a lot, because why kill something that's currently working? So if I'm having a conversation with somebody and they're like, man, I've been on a gain train for 6 months, and you think I'm going to change anything?
Yeah.
I'm not going to change a fucking thing unless there's something that I can change that I know with 100% certainty will have no ill effect. Slight change in technique, stuff like that, but you wait till it slows down, then you change from there, because just to change it for it to be your way isn't their way. And your way should optimally be to make them better.
Yeah.
You see what I'm
It should be
saying?
based on them, not you.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Remember that. As you go through this, remember that.
Yeah.
Because you'll be so fucking surprised at how many times that's not true. It's not true the vast majority of the time.
This is what I used to do. So
Exactly. And you can learn, especially the longer people do things. The longer people do things, you really don't have to do anything except listen to them, regurgitate what they've said, take out the things that they said don't work that they still do, right? Because they do. And you can have this, within a week long of conversations of just, exercise, introduction type stuff. You can get this all figured out, and you'll see where a gap is and can address it then. But so the training history is huge, and the current training you're responsible for. And the future training also needs to be taken into consideration. That's where you're looking at, if it's an athlete, how long are they looking at being able to do this? If it's a strength athlete, power lifter, falling back on that again, is this somebody that's going to be able to do this for 5-10 years? Are they going to be in it for a year or two and then be out? Because that's going to change, the way that I'm going to have them do things. If I think that there's a high likelihood that it's going to be a year or two and they're going to be out, I'm going to do more things that are fun for them that may not be optimal, because I want that buy-in for that longer period of time, because for the changes that I personally want to see, it's probably going to take 3 years. Doesn't do me any good if they're in and out within a year.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's just going to happen because it's just not their thing. But if it is, a coach can do a very excellent job at running people out. That's easy. That's the easy part to do. The hard part to do is to get them to buy in and to like what they're doing, especially when it's this. So that training forecast. So everything, think of it this way, everything's going to have a history, a current, and a forecast. So you got a health history, got a training history, and then you're going to have, you know, a sport analysis. You know, that's kind of what we talked about before. What's the sport that they're participating in? What are they doing? If you're going into a program, all this is like going to be done. You just have to do what the coach tells you to do. It's all going to be done. But if you're in a position to where you are in charge of that, then you want to look at the sport, you want to look at the position that they're playing, you want to look at the energy demands of that position, where the injury history or likelihood is to happen, and then keep that in mind when they develop a program, because as you said, it's all about them and their sport. It's not about, you know, me and powerlifting or you and loving strongman. You can definitely implement, you know, the powerlifting or the strongman into whatever their training is within the variables that they need for themselves, you know, from that standpoint. And you definitely should, because you're going to like that more yourself. The coaching is still an art form too. So the more that you're going to like it, the better you're going to be, the better coach you're going to be. You know, if you're not into Olympic lifts, who the fuck wants to teach an Olympic lift? If you're not into power lifts, who the fuck wants to, you know, it's not just the Olympics, it's everything.
Yeah.
If you're not into strongman, who the fuck wants to teach that? And how good are you going to be at teaching it if you don't even really like it?
Yeah.
You know,
A lot worse than what you loved for 10 plus years.
exactly. So I don't teach a fucking yoke. I'm not going to do it, you know. So farmers walk stuff, I think they all have this place. Most definitely they have their place, but it's not going to have their place with the people I'm working with, because I would suck at coaching them. I can watch, you know, and see if there's any physical, you know, breakdown. You know, are their shoulders going too far? You know, they looking like a, you know, pendulum back and forth instead of a straight line. Some of them stuff is just kind of easy to figure out. But when you're doing the sports analysis, it can get super in depth, and some people get way in depth about it. In my opinion, it just needs to be a broad overview, because weight training for them is GPP. And so you got a pretty big striking range you don't have to hit a bullseye. You just need to hit the target. You know, the more it becomes track and field, Olympic lifting, powerlifting, stuff like that, the closer you need to get to the bullseye, because that weight training and so forth isn't GPP anymore. It goes from GPP into SPP,
Yeah.
you know, and that brings it closer to the target. Then you need to look at the next category. So you got health history, training history, sports analysis, and then weak points. You know, so that is going to be really hard. You'll be able to get some of the weak points just from injury history, stuff like that. But you have physical, mental, and technical from that. A lot of these are going to expose themselves as they're training, but you need to be cognizant to try to pick them up, especially the technical ones you're going to see fast, because it's a movement. It's what you're going to coach. Mental ones are going to be a little harder, you know, to figure out for a while, because people aren't themselves for a while. You know, they have to have comfort. And before they're going to start exposing the real personality from that standpoint. And training is a little bit different, because the real personality may not be their personality, it's their training personality. So is that training personality consistent, or is it not? All right, because if it's not, then that's not the real training personality. It's different. Then from there, with the training weak points, then there's a baseline. So with somebody's baseline, and it can be communication, it can be nonverbal, it can be verbal, it can be the strength, it can be technique. It's all, you're going to start to see something begin to form a horizon. Let's put it that way. To me, that's the most important thing. Yeah, I mean, you can't have a shitty program, let's put it that way, but there's a lot of variance as far as for athletes program. But when you have that horizon, that you have that really cool baseline, anything that disrupts that baseline is where your attention is going to go towards. So if you know what their baseline behavior is for normal training, more intense training, you know, lower intensity training, higher volume training, sprint training, and you start to see those variants of that baseline. That is the biggest indicator that you're ever going to get as far as their ability to recover from what you're doing, which the training, you have two big components. You have the training and then you have recovery, right? One impacts the other one. It's the super compensation model. I'm making it really easy, right? Because it's common sense. Again, we're going to fall back on common sense. So when there's that disruption and the attention isn't put there, do you think that they're going to be able to make the same progress that they would normally make? No. You see that disruption, then how do you address that disruption? That's where the art, kind of comes in there. So at least it's when the questions can start to come in. And the worst question you can ask is, are you okay? Fine. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So you have to know them a little bit better than that from that baseline. The baseline can be, let's take it out of the nonverbal and make it something that's a little more tangible. With their farmer's walk technique. Okay, say most of the time it's pretty solid. Short steps, no side to side movement. Arms are not bent. They're not trying to curl the implement. It's not great, right? It's not great. Some of the steps that are a little longer than the other ones, but it's doable. It's doable to be able to train with and not have to require a shit ton of stopping, verbal cues, and technique and all that stuff. And then one day it's not that. It's more sloppy than what that is. First course of action as a coach is generally get your ass, yell at them, see if they can get there. Sometimes that's all it takes. It's like, you know what, you just need a kick in the ass. Kick in the ass works fine. But it's still a mental note that what created this slump when it's not normal. It doesn't need to be addressed right then. It's not like, hey, look, come here, man, what's going on? You got to get the training done. So you got to do whatever you can do to get the training back on track in the most expedited way. But then that's one red flag, usually if you see one, you're going to see others throughout the training day. But that means now if there's other red flags and that one correction didn't make it, it's looking through, their feedback analysis. Typically you'll have incoming, outgoing analysis of some sort. Some coaches will just, on a scale of 1 to 5, how do you feel coming in? How do you feel going out? And it's basic, but it helps to where that could be a conversation that you need to be able to have, because if you'll notice it first in something like what I'm talking about, to where you can have that conversation, then you find out, okay, look, they're not getting along with their significant other. Okay, now you're aware. So is it going to get worse? Is it going to be better? Who knows? But at least you know what that trigger is that's creating this disruption, to be able to work with them on how to kind of keep that out of the gym or how to address it. It's either or. There's certain boundaries that you have to stay within. But you need to be cognitively aware, because that can be it could also be they haven't ate anything. So the only time that they're eating is when they're coming in for pre-training and post-training, because they're getting their shit, workout drinks or whatever for free. And then the rest of the time they're spending their stipend on shoes, so they don't have, so it's a conversation that you have to have with them in regards to nutrition, or sending them to the dietitian so they understand they can't be spending all their food money on Air Jordans and shit. Like, this stuff happens.
Yeah.
So that falls into that needs analysis, which it doesn't matter what type of programming you have, that still has to be the first most important thing to go in there. Okay, so that's that's a lot. So any thoughts, questions on, I know it's a little fucking weird because you're on a podcast.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, that stuff, none of it's totally out of left field or anything, so it makes sense to me. I don't know how it works for listeners, but yeah.
From what I've seen, it makes sense when you're reading it. It makes sense when somebody's telling you it, but the actual execution of it is horrible.
Yeah.
So this here will trump the best training program ever created, because the best training program ever created, if it's not executed to be able to fit, the bandwidth of the athlete that you're working with, mentally, physically, or whatever it is, it's not the best. You can't say it's the best.
Yeah.
The best program on writing is fine.
Yeah.
Maybe you can go through and not find any inherent problems. Push matches pull or whatever the fuck coefficient somebody's using, everything lines up perfectly. Who gives a fuck?
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, that person could still get their ass kicked by some athlete that only does push-ups and sit-ups before they go to bed when they wake up in the morning. What we want to do is to be able to not have that happen. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So the conditioning program will actually make the athletes better, perform better, and hopefully not get hurt as frequently. So from that standpoint, next time we'll move into the conjugate stuff, which I don't know if we'll podcast on that because I already got 2 or 3 podcasts from that. And then we're going to get into the actual program day, how a day should be structured and stuff like that, because it's, as you start to filter, it's very broad and open at the very top levels, type of periodization, different cycles, all that. As it begins to funnel down, it gets a little more narrow. Like some obvious things I'll throw. You really shouldn't have, I don't want to say can't, but you really shouldn't have a training day that's 100% just isolation movements.
Yeah.
It might have its purpose, but it's very limited in scope on what it's going to be able to accomplish. You also can't have, a training day that's all 6 or 7 big core movements with no designed rest periods. Another thing that you can do, this is a funny thing, the listeners will appreciate it, since I've been basically ignoring them this whole time. If you really want to check somebody's programming knowledge, look at their volume, the sets times reps in any given training program, and then think to yourself, how long would it take to do that set? 20, 40 seconds. Normally they're not going to write tempo, so just go with normal tempo. So you might be looking at a second per repetition. And then sometimes they'll prescribe rest period. If they don't, figure the average rest period is going to be 2 to 3 minutes. Figure the time out. So you'll see training programs that on paper, if you figure this out, would take 3.5 hours to do. Okay? And you ask yourself, what the fuck? So see what I'm saying? It's easy to write the sets and the reps and all that stuff and just throw it out. This is an article or whatever it is, because it looks good.
Yeah.
But nobody goes that extra step to say, can this actually be accomplished within a reasonable amount of time? Say an hour to an hour and a half. I'd like to structure everything for like 45 minutes to an hour, not considering warm-ups, which warm-ups can double that based upon, somebody who's got to warm up to 300 pounds is different than somebody has to warm up to, 1,000 pounds on a leg press or whatever it's going to be. So that can definitely have, some time in there, but man, you can go through and, we'll talk about it off the podcast, but you can go through some really popular programs, start figuring that out and be like, oh my God, does this person even realize this is going to take, there was one I found one time that would take 5.5 hours to do. And there's no supersets. There's none of this A1, B1 shit.
Yeah.
It's just no circuits. It's like
this list of exercises.
Yeah, this is just bullshit. But that's where, as we talked before, that bullshit detector, the education background kind of comes in a little bit, especially from this standpoint. And it's sad that a lot of this stuff isn't taught in college, so you get, well, I don't want to go down that road, but anyhow, there's still a benefit to knowing exercise physiology for those people that are listening to Exercise Science. There's a huge benefit to knowing that, because your bullshit detector is much bigger. But anyhow, we'll shut this part down unless you have any other questions.
I got one question. Yeah. It's not part of the block periodization thing. It's a conjugate question because I'm writing an article for Conjugate for Strongman. It's gonna be a guide. I'm gonna email a bunch of people, but as we have our time each week, and this was suddenly a podcast. Dynamic effort waves. If you're doing Strongman Conjugate, and say, for example, it's dynamic effort upper, and you have more than one upper body implement coming up in a contest, whether you have 2 separate pressing events or maybe you have like a medley where you got to go like 1 rep log, 1 rep axle, 1 rep circus dumbbell. Ideas on what you do for dynamic effort? Like I was saying, wave each week, you might have a new one, and then that can almost align time-wise with your max effort, so you're never going 3 weeks without practicing one.
Okay, the first thing I would do from the dynamic standpoint is figure out what the reps are going to be. So typically with dynamic work, you're not going to do a lot of waving of the reps. You'll wave the sets or the accommodating resistance and so forth, but a lot of times the reps aren't going to change. And for myself, I won't change those because I want those reps to be pretty specific to what the total time under tension forever, whatever the lift's going to be. So for instance, a maximum bench press that somebody's going to strain on might take 3, about the same time as it might take to do 3 reps at say 0.8 meters per second or whatever it's going to be. So it's pretty close. It can be extended to 5. A lot of that depends upon, does the person take it out when they bench? Do they hold it for a second or two before they bring it down? All these factors kind of can go into there. So you have a range of maybe 3 to 5 reps dynamically that I would be comfortable prescribing for a bench press based upon that. I don't want to say time under tension because that
time to complete your set of 1.
Yeah, because one person will look at time under tension a little bit differently than another person. Where there was, when I was doing my stupid spider bar shit, when I was speaking to one person about this, they were saying, well, your time under tension is like 2.5 seconds or something like that. I'm like, you might want to go back and look at it again, because by the time you get underneath there, and I'm not walking it out still, as soon as you get underneath there and you start flexing everything, is that muscle not under tension? Because when that's tight, you might have 3 or 4 seconds of, compressing that spring, tension, right? Before you even take it out. Then when you take it out, you got 1 or 2 count before you go down. And then and when I timed it, it was 14 seconds, for 1 rep. So you go back and you look at what the speed work is, where does that fall within that 14 reps? So let's go back and what are the movements that you're talking about? So I assume it's some overhead, right?
Well, this was broad because this was going to be like a guide and a template. But like for this example, we're saying overhead, just I was more specifically asking about waving different implements in as your dynamic effort because you don't have always squat.
Yeah. So if it's the overhead, the first question I would have is this going to be an overhead for a single or for reps? Okay, because that's going to play a factor into this. From that standpoint, if it's for a single, then I would probably keep the repetitions in the 2 to 3 range. If it's going to be for reps, maybe the 3 to 5. If you start to go over the 5, you're going to lose the ability to be able to flex with the force, the compensatory acceleration, speed, whatever you want to call it, that I would want to see for that. So if it's unknown, then I would perhaps wave, to stick to 3-week phases. Louis found that to be best. I found it to be best. I'm going to give the credit to him because he found it to be best. That's what I always did, and that's what I found to be best. You can do a wave of 5s. You can do a wave of 3s. Or if it's going to be 2 different implements or 2 different dynamic lifts in the same day, which I think you can do because while they are total body from that standpoint, you can compress, the set. So you wouldn't want to have 10 sets of each, dynamic thing. So at the max that I've seen, 20 sets is about the most somebody that's conditioned is going to be able to handle for any type of dynamic work where they're going to be able to keep any type of force, and that has to be trained to achieve. So each movement, I'd probably start at 4 or 5 sets, probably 4 of that 3 to 5 range. Maybe the first one for 5s, the second one for 3s, or vice versa. Doesn't matter. I would just keep it the same, what's first and what's second for the 3 weeks, and then possibly flip it and then go from there. With it being 2 different movements, I don't know if I would throw in bands with those. Maybe chains on one and then nothing on the other, because you're asking a lot, to recover from. It's definitely doable. Here's how we know it's doable. A lot of people will do, plyometric box jumps and stuff like that on the same day that they'll do their dynamic squats. So they're basically doing 2 dynamic things to begin with, or they'll do the dynamic squats and then quote unquote speed pulls that are in there as well. So definitely can be tolerated, and you'll be able to see pretty quick with Conjugate if it is tolerated or if it isn't, because it will impact. Like dynamic work will actually show the impact on the max effort stuff. So the max effort stuff is usually falling pretty hard. They're not able to chip away at a PR here and there. It's usually because whatever they're doing on that dynamic day is impeding their ability to recover, so they can't display it on max effort day. Dynamic day suffers, and the programming is pretty straightforward. Then usually whatever they're doing on the mat is impede. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So it's looking upstream instead of looking at the actual pond that you're in, where everybody wants to look in that pond, and that's usually the biggest mistake, especially with Conjugate. It's usually, you have to recover, right? Did that answer your question? So yeah, you can do things, but I would bring the sets down to 4. Then I would try to match the time under tension the best you can.
But you do them all in one day.
Yeah, no more than 2. Yeah, I would do them all 2 in one day. Yeah.
What about like an off season? If you're running Conjugate in the off season and you got to press things overhead, or you got to deadlift something, but you may not know what it is. You pick something you suck at, like, do you just strict press a bunch? Or if you suck at, the jerk, practice the jerk for your 12 by 1.
My first question there would be, is it necessary for the person to do overhead year round? Okay, that's the first question. And that just kind of falls back on, I don't want to say that overhead pressing hurts people, because a lot of people prove that fact to be incorrect. But what I will say is, when you look at lifters that have been around for 10, 15 years, and I look at what things can they no longer do that they used to be able to do. Things that top the list are dips, chins, overhead presses, and really a bench press doesn't even hit the list, but those are always, it's like, man, I can't dip anymore. It's always those. So that doesn't mean that those movements created this problem, right? But it does kind of throw a red flag to me that how can I do those movements in either the most efficient manner possible, or how can I do them with the least amount of repetition that's necessary. So if it's an overhead, is that something that, and I don't know this because I don't train strongman, is that something that can be abandoned for a period of time and then put back in, and then it bounces right back up the way that, say, a deadlift would for a power lifter? Or is it that one thing that you can't really get that far away from, and perhaps just needs to be done 3-week phase, 3 weeks off, 3-week phase, 3 weeks off? Or does it have to be all the time? So I can't answer that.
Yeah.
So I personally wouldn't put it in all the time, and if I did, I would definitely bring the load down for 3 weeks, so maybe, I don't want to use speed strength and stuff like that, but maybe drop it and use more chain, on one phase, actually, no, that wouldn't work on that because it's a kind of an inverse relationship when dealing with chains because the most vulnerable positions at the top.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to use chains or bands with any
yeah.
overhead because it's not conducive to what that strength curve is. So from that standpoint, it would just be lower end percentages without maximum compensatory, so sub-maximal loading for 3 weeks and then dynamic sub-maximal. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
From the overhead part.
Yeah. So, so you're saying, like, for example, you had your 3 weeks of overhead and 3 weeks of no overhead. Are you doing traditional speed work with, like, bench on your non-overhead dynamic effort?
It's not really specific to a strongman at all.
Yeah.
So I don't even know if I would prioritize that in the top section of a training program. They're going to want to do it because it's fun and, but I don't know how much it really
matters.
Yeah, I really don't. Sometimes it's tested on that. Some events, it's fucking rare. Overhead's always in there. So I think it would be more of the just phasing, the type of pressing to be able to reduce the wear and tear as much as I can. So, potentially say a barbell for 3 weeks and then a neutral grip log for 3 weeks. And if you need to lower the load a little bit more, if you go to a close grip log, you're not going to be able to press as much. Typically, you won't be able to press as much than you would with a wider grip log. So sometimes the answer is being able to find that variant that you can't do a lot of weight with because of either the implement or the grip. And then that inherently lowers the workload. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So the intensity can actually stay the same, but the workload is going to change based upon the implement. For instance, from a powerlifting or squatting standpoint, a spider bar, somebody that's spider with a spider bar, or even a front squat, it's going to be much less than what they're going to be able to do with SS yoke bar or a straight bar. So the percentages can stay the same, but by changing that implement, you drop the workload, sometimes thousands of pounds, because the amount of weight as expressed by that intensity drops. See what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So that could be the answer there is what are, say, 3 different types of overhead pressing. What's the strongest one, middle, and then the least, and then you wave those 3 over 3 week periods using the same, wave, but the workload changes substantially. See what I'm saying?
Yeah.
That could be the answer there. I mean, there's multiple answers, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
but
of course.
That to me, in my head, from this conversation without really thinking about it a whole lot, is the most logical conclusion I can come up right now, just talking through it.
Well, that was my end cap. That was the one thing after everything.
Cool. You can bolt out if you want, and I will go on to these other questions.
Off to work.
Did you have some for the live stream? You want to take those ones first?
What's that?
Did you want to take the live
Yes, let's take those, because I've been ignoring these guys since we started.
All right, we're about to hit the live stream up, guys. Let me look through them right now. Okay. Thanks for coming on, Mason.
No problem. Pleasure to be on.
Yeah. First one for you, Dave, is tips on staying tight as a sink and heave bencher for sets of more than 2 to 3 reps. That makes sense?
Don't be a sink and heave bencher. I don't understand why you're doing that. Because you're not allowed to. I mean, if you compete, you're not allowed to do that when you compete. It's going to be a heave. So I would not sink and heave. That's my answer there. So what was the full question again?
Let me see. For sets of more than 2 to 3 reps. It was more so for staying tight, is what I'm understanding.
Yeah, well, if you're sinking and heaving, you're not going to be able to stay tight. I mean, that kind of contradicts
it,
staying tight. So, something that you can think about is, verbal cues are kind of hard to convey over a podcast where you're not working with somebody personally. But, one thing I will try to tell people to do is to keep the sternum up, act like there's a string pulling the sternum to the top of the ceiling or the gym from that standpoint. And that can keep that base a little bit more solid from that standpoint. Another thing that I like to try to put out there is bring your body to the bar, as you're bringing the bar down. So a way to do this would be, if you have a rack or a bench that's got safeties in there, is to set a bar, say an inch or two off of your chest. So you would, much like you were going to do a dead press or a pin press from a very bottom position, keep a bar like inch or two off your chest. Use a broom. It doesn't really matter what if it's a broomstick, dowel rod, whatever it is, a bar, and then get into your bench position. And then from that bench position, without lifting anything, try to get your body to touch the bar. So that can be on how you set up, how you're breathing, what you're trying to expand into the air from that standpoint, and reach basically with your chest, abdomen, sternum, reach to try to get that bar to get into that better position. And then when you get in that better position and that base is solid, you'll be tighter. And then once you're tighter, you're not going to have to, that sink and heave is going to be very counterproductive, because if you're tight and you try to sink and heave, you lose your tightness. So if you're tight, the ability to want to sink and heave is going to completely go away.
This guy said, I went for a gym deadlift PR but felt my back going, so I dropped it. What are some exercises to strengthen the mid-back so this doesn't happen to me next time? And he said, I know my technique is not perfect.
I was going to say there's a lot of factors that can go into that, that one scenario. So it could be, that you're overreaching. It could be the technique isn't very good. You weren't prepared to be able to do the single. And here's something to think about is, beginners and intermediates can get away with a lot of things that advanced lifters really can't get away with, but they're getting away from it non-optimally. In a very simple to explain way is they're getting away with it because there's really not enough weight to really get hurt that bad. So the issue here's what to think about, so I can step back a little bit. People that train for the sport of powerlifting, it may take 3, 4, 5, 6 months just for their peaking phase to be able to max out in a competition. So if it's taking people that do this seriously months to be able to get into shape or condition to be able to display their true 1 rep max, then that begs the question to me of why somebody feels they have to test their 1 rep max in the gym every week. So that inherently becomes an issue if you're testing the same movement over and over and over and over in the gym, because at the same time, if you're testing it all the time, when are you building it? So that's the other question that comes up from that standpoint. So I don't know if this is so much a function of you having to build your mid back, because over and over again, when people have a sticking point like you're describing, they always want to go to what exercises do I need to do to fix this, where there's a mental component, a technical component, and a physical component to overcoming any sticking point. And in my experience, the physical component is usually only 10 or 20% of the time what the problem is. The problem is usually mental or technical. So I would say you got to dial back, because you already said your technique needs improvement. So I would dial back, fix the technique. It's not going to be perfect. Nobody's ever gets to the phase of being perfect, but fix it, more so. And then from there, build it, from that standpoint.
For somebody who trains Conjugate but doesn't plan on competing at the time, how would you go about testing maxes or some type of mock meet as well as weeks ran for a cycle before testing max lifts?
I wouldn't worry about the testing the max lifts. I would still do the max effort work, right? But that's going to be different lifts. And the further somebody is out from a peak or competition or whatever it is, the way I like to think about it or have people think about it is the further you are out, the safer the max effort exercise should be. So if I was to sit down and have a discussion with you and ask you what max effort exercises are you 100% comfortable with that you can do and not think that you're going to tweak or pull anything, you're going to give me a list of those are the movements that you want to do. When you start to build on that base foundation of strength, that list actually begins to increase a little bit because your strength increases. So that's where I would stick, and sometimes that becomes a variant of whatever that movement is. So this is where, accommodating the resistance chains, bands and stuff like that can come in really handy, because if you're really far off your max strength, which I do personally myself every couple of years, I get way off of it intentionally. I can't come back and just start hitting the max effort exercises the way that I used to. So, I already know going into it that whatever movements I do are going to be the safest I can possibly do, and they're not going to be strong. So I'm not even thinking about PRs. I'm not thinking about any of that shit. I'm just thinking about doing better than I did on it last time until that base gets built over a period of 4 or 5 months or so. And then when that base starts to come into play, then I'll look at things like the reverse bands, chains, things that are going to deload the more vulnerable part of the position while strengthening the stronger strength curve part of the position, and stick with those, and then go that range. And then when everything comes back into focus, then I'll pull some of the accommodating stuff out, put back in some of the movements that I know what the max is or where it should be, so it becomes a real test without depressing the fuck out of myself, because then I'll at least be in striking range and kind of go from there. So that's what I would do from that.
Okay. This guy said, hey, Dave, any particular recommendation for incorporating seated calf raises into programming in terms of sets, reps, and frequency?
I don't know if it fucking matters. Personally, I like the seated calf raise for powerlifting more than any other calf raise. I've seen it over and over with myself and other people really, really help anybody that's got any knee pain that's they're dealing with. I've seen it help stabilize the knee tons of times. And where to put it in, front end or back end, that's my answer to that. So either part of whatever warm-ups that you're going to be doing before you get into your main stuff, or at the very back end. I would not put it in within the framework of the main work that has to be done, because it's simple to do. It's not very exhausting. So when you're building the main part of your training program, you're starting to you're concerned with managing fatigue, and building fatigue. And you put a movement like that in after a couple big movements before you move into the other things, and then that allows a whole lot of your body to be able to rest, recover, to be able to hit things that are after that, with more weight, which may be counterproductive to what's actually structured for the training day, if that makes sense. Some people would see that as a good thing. I don't. I see it as a bad thing, because as you move through the training program, through the training day, you should become more and more fatigued as the day goes on, which is going to, lessen the loads that are going to be used on those bottom tier exercises. And if you put too long of a rest period in there, then it's going to increase that, which that's counterproductive what I'm trying to achieve if I'm putting a program together.
Okay. What's the one piece of advice you have for someone in their first year of powerlifting? So not so much for a first meet, but just the first year.
Try to figure things out for yourself. You can, have a coach if you want, but even if that's the case, ask a lot of questions and try to figure things out, on your own, because that's a huge component. And one of the questions that I have here to answer in a minute that kind of plays into that of what's being lost, with the lifters today is that, that ability to be able to figure things out for themselves and to basically be able to auto-regulate their own training because they're putting something off to somebody else. And you may have to do that because you don't care. You just want to delegate it to somebody else. You don't want to worry about it, whatever reason there's going to be. But the fact of the matter is, if you want to progress in the sport, you want to get better, you're going to have to worry about it. There's a degree of personal responsibility and accountability that has to go along with, becoming better. So the sooner that can be stressed and realized, the better it's going to be, because you won't have to try to figure it out, a few years down the road, because most people honestly don't make it a few years down the road because they don't know what the hell to do themselves. So this inherently is creating a situation to where, we have a lot of people starting the sport that leave very fast, probably at, a higher rate than it's ever been before in the past. And I think that would go away, which it's not going to go away at this point. But for those people that, want to try to stick with the sport for a longer period of time, I think they're doing themselves a disservice by not trying to figure out what's working for them and what's not.
Okay. I'm looking right now. What's an exercise that's really popular but does more harm than good, in your opinion?
That can be every exercise and no exercise. It's not really it's not a movement problem. It's the quality of movement problem, and how the movement's implemented and where it's implemented. So I don't believe there's any such thing as a bad exercise. It's just poor implementation of the exercise. So if I knew, a context of the situation and how it's being implemented, then I could be able to answer a little bit better. But in my mind, there are no exercises that are, 100% you never do.
Okay. And then kind of to piggyback off that, does the kettlebell swing have a place in powerlifting?
It can, I'll just leave it at that. I mean, I know people that have gotten a ton out of that because of the posterior chain, the hip development, back development, everything that can be put in there. So yeah, it can, as can a lot of other things.
Okay. Hey, this guy said, how do you suggest getting the most out of a deadlift bar and knee wraps? I'm new to competing at a wide stance squatter and a sumo puller.
Okay, so these are two different questions. So it's not a deadlift stance or a deadlift with knee wraps. So it's a deadlift bar and knee wraps, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, so the deadlift bar is I can sit here and tell you that you need to pull the slack out of it, take the tension out of it, and all this other kind of stuff, but that's making an assumption that your deadlift is going to be strong enough to be able to have the plates remain on the floor as you pull the slack out of the bar, which in most cases is a big assumption. So from that standpoint, if the deadlift falls under that point, then it's really not going to make any difference if it's a deadlift bar, a straight bar, or any other bar. It's not going to matter because it's going to function basically exactly the same. Now, with that in mind, there are still some things that you can do where, the pull and the slack out of the bar is definitely, conducive to being able to use the deadlift bar. But before you can pull the slack out of the bar, so we got to go back a notch, you're going to have to pull the bar into the hub of it. So the shaft of the bar into the hub, you're going to hear a little click is basically what I'm trying to say, is if you have the bar loaded on the floor and you just walk up to the bar, not as you're going to deadlift, but just put your hand under the bar and just lift up on it a little bit, you're going to hear a click. And that's going to be a click of the bar basically hitting the inside of the bar where the sleeves are. When you do that, you're essentially doing the same thing as what somebody would do when they're pulling the slack out of the bar. What that does to the lifter that's actually pulling is that tightens up your body, and a lot of times it will shift your hips back just a little bit more. It gets the shoulders back just a little bit more, but essentially it just tightens up the body. So that's the answer to the question of, how you get more out of a deadlift bar, because if you're not doing that, then you're not able to pull slack out of the bar and the other stuff. Knee wraps was the other part, right?
Yep.
That's personal preference. It's also squat style as well. So if somebody sits back a lot when they squat, then they're basically not going to get as much out of a wrap than what they would normally get out of a wrap if the knee was to go midfoot, around that range. So the first question is, what is the squat style? What's it look like? This isn't saying that if you squat with your knee over your ankle that you should squat with your knee over midfoot, or vice versa. Your squat technique has got to be solid for your squat technique, and that's based upon what the bar path looks like and what the biomechanics look like of the lift. So I'll just leave that out of the equation for now. But if it is that person that's sitting back, you don't need to use wraps in training as much as what somebody else would, because it's not going to have really as much of a carryover. It's not going to be as painful, so to say, and it's not going to be that hard to get used to. So from that standpoint, if you're an advanced lifter, you may only need wraps for one training session during the cycle and then the meet. If you're not, then enough to be able to get used to it. Everybody's got different theories on this. So, a lot of people will tell you, start putting the wraps on with anything over 405. Well, what if the person doesn't squat over 405? So, and then put them on after you get to 50%, whatever it's going to be. So my answer to this is basically falling on what the wraps are used for. Is there knee pain? What's the purpose for using the reps? So I have to know what that is. If it's because you're going to compete in them, okay, then you need to know how to be able to compete in them and get the greatest bang for your buck from them. If you've never competed with them before, then you probably need to start using them now and trying to figure it out. What I will tell you is, we sell, probably over 20 different knee wraps. The type of knee wrap that somebody uses is basically based upon personal preference. I can wrap somebody or teach somebody to wrap with a normal knee wrap that will get them the same carryover that one of the stronger, more well-known knee wraps. The style of how you wrap is far more important than the tensile strength of the wrap, assuming that the wrap's not a complete piece of shit. And there are some that are. So from that standpoint, the wraps are more of a comfort thing than really anything else. From that standpoint, people will try to tell you differently one way or another, and that's usually based upon who's giving their wraps for free and how it goes from there. So from that standpoint, find wraps that you're comfortable using and learn different patterns. You can X pattern over the knee. You can keep most of the wrap behind the knee. You can, go from the knee up, from the quad down. There's multiple ways to try to wrap. Try them all to be able to figure out which one that you like the most. Try different tightnesses of the wrap to see what you like most. This is going to take time, and experience to be able to do it, but over a period of time, you'll figure it out. Then once you figure it out, don't change it because somebody tells you to change it. Whatever feels right to you is what you want to stick with, and then just work on, getting more out of that wrap from that standpoint. I don't know if I answered that or not.
I think you did.
It's a hard one to answer.
Yeah. This will be a fun one. This guy said, powerlifter's diet. How much to eat? I'm new to powerlifting. I want to lean out but keep my size and strength. How do you go about it? Because you already kind of gave the advice for beginners, powerlifters, but you didn't quite touch on.
You know,
this.
I don't want to sit here and tell you to eat whatever you want, because that's giving that's, you can't eat fucking chips, every meal, and not have a balanced diet. Considering what people would say is a balanced diet, which depends upon whatever fad and trends going on at the time. Keep it simple. Let's put it that way. Keep it simple. You can get wrapped up into all the different diet trends and all the other stuff that's going on, where let's just make this easy. I'm yet to meet a person that doesn't know that if they had 3 foods in front of them, which food would be a better choice. So my first advice is make the better choice most of the time. So that kind of covers that. Common sense from that standpoint. Stay hydrated, which is another one that is kind of common sense, but not. And don't get too wrapped up in a protein from that standpoint. Yes, you need protein to be able to recover, to build muscle. That's kind of a given, but that's going to be somewhat dependent upon, how much carbohydrates and fat you have in the body as energy sources. Because if those are limited, and then your body has to start using the protein to convert into, an energy source, then obviously you need more protein, because that protein is going to be used as energy, which becomes more expensive energy, because protein typically costs more than carbohydrates or fats. So what I'm trying to say here is, if the carbohydrate content is higher, then the protein can be a little lower. If the carbohydrate and the fats as well, if the carbohydrate and the fats are lower, then the protein is going to have to be a little bit higher. I'm not big on giving recommendations on here's what this exact percentage would be, especially when it's a power lifter. You just have to be able to recover. So if you're training solid and you're not overreaching with your training, and you're not able to recover from training session to training session, then more than likely it's probably a factor of hydration and diet. From that standpoint, keep it simple and make better choices. If you're not recovering, eat a little bit more. If the more that you're eating, starts to, put on weight, and you start to get fatter because you're eating more, then first look at what you're actually eating. Because if you're just dumping in a bunch of empty calories, then the nutritional value of that's going to be limited, except for that calories that are going to be excess, from that standpoint. So that's I guess I'm just a no bullshit person, so I don't have any supplements or fucking diet plan to sell. So I don't have an answer that's going to satisfy most of the people, because they don't want to hear, just make better choices, because that's not how it works. But that's what the real answer is. Make better choices and stay hydrated.
Okay. When doing a block periodization type of training, during the first phase of the training block, do you add more weight each week, or do you stay with the same weight for the first phase?
It depends on what the block is. It depends upon what the goal of the block is. If it's a conditioning block, then that may not actually be necessary, because you may be ramping up the volume each week. So if you're increasing the sets each week, then there's many ways that you can create adaptation throughout a training program. One of them is to increase the intensity, which load or weight. That's one way. The other way is to decrease rest periods. Another way is to be able to increase sets. Another way is to increase repetitions. Another way would be able to increase the training density, which is kind of a factor of manipulating the rest periods and putting more, movements in. That's a whole nother way, is to add more movements, to add more volume. So especially when you're dealing with, a front end conditioning block like that, then there's a lot more variant with that from that standpoint. So yes, what you're saying is definitely one way to be able to do that, which is going to be more conducive to, a realization, or, a translation or whatever the fuck they call it, translation, you know, from a strength phase, more or less. You know, it really depends upon what the goal of the block is.
Okay. This guy said, my gym has a SSB, but the camber is at an angle, making it feel more like a front squat. Will I still be able to get the same transfer from box squats and seated good mornings?
I'm not a big, well, this is after I just said I don't think there's any bad exercises. I'm not a big advocate of a seated good morning, so I'll put that out there from the beginning. From what you're talking about, if it's got more of a camber or less of a camber, it's not really this big relative factor unless you're going to use one bar one week and a completely different bar the next week. You're going to have the same stimulus over the 3-week wave that you're using, or whatever the wave is, 4 weeks, 5 weeks. That camber is not going to change. The stimulus isn't going to change. So it's really not that relevant from that standpoint.
Okay. So on the bench, my right shoulder always protract when I really strain, but never my left one. Any insight? P.S. I dislocated that shoulder 10 years ago.
Well, that's probably the reason right there. And I would assume that is probably happening with all the light weights as well. It's just not happening to the same degree because it's not under as much stress as what that is. You know, I would back it up and figure out what's creating this to happen. You know, is it your lats? Is it, you know, front delts? Is it pec? I mean, there's a lot of things that could be attributed to. So I would ask, you know, a physical therapist or somebody that's into corrective therapy, exercise, whatever you want to call it, that is more qualified to be able to answer this question, or at least is legally qualified to be able to answer the question. So I would find what the limiting factor is that's creating the problem, then address that, and then the problem should take care of itself.
Okay. What do you do if you get a slight injury in your training cycle and you are close to a meet? For instance, a cramp in your back or hamstring, quad. Nothing serious, but definitely not 100% for next week.
Okay. The question was, what do I do? So I need to state that.
Yeah, what would you do then?
Yeah, I'm not telling you what you should do, because if I was being asked to tell you what you should do, I would tell you to go see somebody that's a physical therapist, doctor, or is qualified to be able to give you an answer specific to your issue. Now, since the question was asking me what would I personally do, fuck it. I deal with it. You know, to me, things like that have been part of the process since after my first 5 or 6 years of training. You know, it's figuring out, are you injured, hurt, or fucked up? You know, so if it's just a little injury, to me, it was not a big deal. It can certainly be trained through or around. So there's a difference between, for me, of training around things and training through things. And that's where the biggest factor had to come in to play, is if I had to train through something, that basically, here's how I determine this. If, say it's a hamstring or something that was tweaked, is I would find an isolation movement that I could put almost 100% of all the focus on that muscle group. Then obviously I would use the lightest weight that I could get any type of stimulus from, and then I would start doing reps on it. If it hurt, which it would, on rep 1, 2, 3, 4, but then after, on say rep 5, or as I continue to keep doing reps, if it hurt less and less and less and less as the set went on, then I knew this is something that I could train through. Then I would use exercises that were like that. That may hurt a little bit when I started the set, but then the pain would decrease significantly as the set went on. Those would be the exercises that I would use to be able to get through it. Now, if I did that same exercise and the pain didn't subside or didn't decrease in any way whatsoever, then I knew this is something I had to train around, which is a different situation than having to train through. So training around is, avoiding movements that actually hurt it, perhaps wrapping the shit up. There's a lot of factors, a lot of things that you can do to be able to train around it that are restorative, that are active, that are passive. This is where, different recovery modalities would come into play and things from that standpoint. So that's my answer of what I did, in one way or would do.
Okay. This guy said my bench press sticking point is right off my chest. I use a narrow grip due to shoulder issues. What do you recommend to focus on this weakness?
Addressing the shoulder issues, because your weakness off your chest is a direct relation to your shoulder issues. So, moving your grip in is one way to try to compensate, for the issue that you actually should be addressing. Kind of in the question that I just answered of training around or through things, you're trying to train through something that you should either train around or find a way to correct the issue that's happening. So that would be my answer on that, is you've already tried to train around it and you're still dealing with the issues of it. So you can continue to keep going down this street and finding different things, to keep training around it. For instance, go on a 1 board, 2 board, shoulder saver, whatever, reverse bands, whatever you have to do to be able to train around it. And you're still not going to address what the root cause of it is, unless that root cause has gone from injured to fucked up. I mean, if it's fucked up to where it's never going to get better, then that's a different discussion. But in most cases, that's not the issue. The issue is you got to address whatever that is and then go from there.
Okay. This guy said weak off the floor in sumo. What exercises should I do to bring up strength?
Look at your starting position of the sumo. I can probably guarantee that it needs to be, that there's some corrections that can be addressed with that. Again, that's falling back on to what I said earlier, what I've been saying for probably 2 decades now, is, everybody wants to go to the exercises instead of going to the actual technical problem, which is more than likely the problem. But you can definitely do, the exercises to increase it. So you'll just have, a stronger shitty deadlift instead of fixing the deadlift, to be able to have the best deadlift that you can possibly display. So from that standpoint, being weak off the floor is usually going to be a function of tension. You're not as tight as what you need to be able to initiate, the drive off of the floor. So anything that you can do that's going to work on your ability to, get tighter as a whole is going to be able to help. Situations like this, a small deficit can help from that standpoint. If you start to go too low, when I say small deficit, I'm speaking 1 or 2 mats. So like an inch or 2, you start to go a little deeper than that, then it becomes more of a quad exercise and it becomes, a pulling exercise, which is fine if that's what you want to target. But in this case, that's not typically what you're going to be able to target.
Okay. Dave, how do you get through truly max effort deadlift and have something left for accessories?
Sometimes you don't. That's where you got to rely on how you feel and your own feedback. And that's not, for most people, the deadlift is going to take a hell of a lot more out of them than what any other max effort exercise will, unless they're built to deadlift. And that's typically not going to be the case. But if you are 100% smoked, as you're stating, and then you pack it up, man, you're done. Call it a day. And if you feel so inclined, then come back the next day and do accessories. But I don't even know if I'd have somebody do that. If just pack it up.
All right, for this one, just give the answer you can based on the information. He said He just ordered a reverse hyper for his garage gym, and his deadlift is mid 700s while his squat is only mid to low 500s. His chiropractor suggested that abs and core is the reason for the difference. I'm thinking the combo of more ab work and reverse hyper should help. Yeah, that's it.
I would ask your chiropractor what he thinks instead of just assuming what you think he thinks. So that's
No, he said his chiro suggested that it was abs and
but not lower back. So
Oh,
he
gotcha,
said,
gotcha.
so abs and core, but didn't say that. So, I would circle back with him on that. As with any new movement, you want to start you don't want to go completely apeshit on it. You want to be able to, let's put it this way, back it up a little bit, because I know, a lifter mentality is you want to get in there, you want to be able to load it up and kind of bang out whatever you can. Start at a weight that isn't really that hard, but is enough to bring blood into the area. So with your deadlifts, say it's going to be 3/4 per side, 150 pounds, maybe 200 pounds, maybe, that might even be too much because, to me, 400 pounds is, a moderate weight, so maybe it's just 2 plates per side, but whatever it is, start it the least that you can start at that still get some kind of result. And then over a period of time, you can increase, the weight on that, because as we all know, as you overload, a movement, the response is going to be conducive. So it can be overloading by weight, it can be overloading by reps. There's multiple ways to be able to do that, but we're just speaking weight here. So if you have the ability to be able to make progress that's going to globally impact, squat, deadlift, and other lifts by going from 200 pounds to 300 pounds. So say that's, 100 pounds of weight jumps, albeit 15, 20 pounds per week, whatever it's going to be. That's 4 weeks, 5 weeks of progress that's going to globally impact all these other movements where, yes, you may be able to go in there and just start, at 300 or 350 and go from there, but then you're not going to be able to progress at that same rate because you're going to go from that 300 to 350, then it's going to start to get really hard at, 350, 400, whatever it's going to be. And then your ability to breathe is going to suck because it's a lot of weight swinging up through there. So what I'm trying to say is when you implement a new exercise, take advantage of the fact that you're going to suck at it to be able to squeeze out as many weeks of progress as you possibly can, because that's all adaptations that can happen. There's going to be more time of adaptations than if you just started balls out and we're only to get those adaptations for a few weeks before you need to start being more creative with your programming to be able to achieve those.
Okay. Do you believe that rack pulls above the knee have an application, or just a whole lot of ego and a ruined bar?
Of course. Any exercise has application. It's how it's programmed and how it's put in. Yes, it can fuck your bars up. So there's a factor there, as well. So, a lot of gym owners are going to fucking hate that because of that standpoint. So if it's rack pulls, you should have rack pull bar, which should be an old bent bar. You should use a rod and pin, setup. So the weight's going to be displaced throughout the pin instead of fucking the bar all up. So, and if you're doing them properly, I believe there's Steve Goggins did a video for elitefts.com that's on there. You may be able to just search Steve Goggins pin pulls. He's got a tutorial where he talked about how to do pin pulls above your knee. And if you're doing them properly, yes, it might be more than what you can typically deadlift. But for most people that aren't proficient in doing the rack pulls, it's going to be less than what they can deadlift. So it's not, ego might be a factor, but it will be ego bruising if they do it right, because they're not going to be able to do 300 pounds more than what they can deadlift.
Okay. Does having a straight bar path on the squat mean your technique is good? Mine looks a bit like a good morning, but my bar path is straight.
That's what I look at first. So I will look at actually, it's not what I look at first. I'll look at, the biomechanics as well as the bar path. So as a power lifter, you want a straight bar path. So that's going to be the shortest distance between 2 points. So but that's not the whole story. You can have a straight bar path and then biomechanically the rest of the movement just looks like shit. I'd have to see it to be able to know what you're talking about, because looking like a good morning can be a good or a bad thing based upon somebody's structure. If you look at it and it looks like you want to cringe, then more likely it's probably cringe worthy and it needs to be addressed. So a good squat should look like a good squat, but there is some degree of variance from that standpoint.
Okay, here's a good one to end on. This guy said, do you change your programming at all when cutting, or do you just power through with the lower energy levels?
You have to change your program based upon the energy demands and your ability to recover. So if your ability to recover is being impeded because of, a calorie deficit, then that has to be the program has to be changed to be able to address that. Just powering through things is not the most conducive thing to do, because if you can't recover from it, you're just going to keep digging yourself a deeper and deeper hole from that standpoint. So the question to throw back would be, is there some manipulation that you can be able to do to your macronutrients that could change your ability to recover? And that could be something to be able to look at to see if you can, maintain, being able to drop that weight with enhancing your ability to recover a little bit better. I think I have some of these questions, or at least one of them that. Okay. Yeah, we can do that. I think that's it.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in, guys, and catch us next time.
All right, thanks, guys.